Today I will talk about a rupture in the world order, the end of a pleasant fiction and the beginning of a harsh reality, where geopolitics, where the large main power geopolitics is submitted to no limits, no constraints.
There is a moment in every criminal trial where the defense narrative collapses under the weight of the forensic record. We have reached that moment in the trial of the international order. For years, we have been told that compliance buys safety. We have been told that if you just follow the rules of the great powers, you will be protected. That is the story.
And faced with this logic, there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. Well, it won't.
That is the comforting fiction. Tonight, we have the evidence that this story is over. We have the admission on the record that the sign has been taken out of the window. The judgment begins tonight with a declaration regarding the conduct of Donald Trump and the authorities aligned with his worldview. We are looking at the specific claim that the international rules-based order still functions as advertised, and that the aggressive, transactional bullying by a hegemon is merely a negotiation tactic that allies must endure to survive. That is a lie. The claim that submission to no limits and no constraints is the natural logic of relations that we must accept is false. The assertion that middle powers like Canada are powerless against this aggression is a lie. We must define this lie with precision because it is the foundation of the current geopolitical crisis. The lie comes from the highest levels of quote-unquote great power authority, specifically identified in our evidence as the quote-unquote hegemons, and implicitly and explicitly linked to Donald Trump. The lie is the assertion that quote-unquote might makes right is the only option left. The lie is the assertion by authorities like Donald Trump that Greenland is under such immediate threat from Russia or China that it justifies hostile tariffs and challenges to sovereignty. The lie is also the broader, insidious argument that countries must go along to get along. The lie is that compliance will buy safety. This is the specific promise made by the powerful to the less powerful. If you submit, if you stay silent, if you put the sign in the window, you will be safe. Our evidence tonight proves that this bargain no longer works. The speaker identifying this lie is the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney. He identifies the false authority of a system where the rules-based order is fading and where the strong believe they can do what they can and the weak must suffer. We turn now to the forensic evidence contained in the transcript. This is not opinion. This is the testimony of a head of state analyzing the breakdown of global law. Exhibit A is the rupture. Prime Minister Carney does not call this a transition. He states clearly, I will talk about a rupture in the world order. The evidence proves that the present fiction has ended. What is that fiction? It is the fiction that we are living in a rules-based system. Carney testifies that we are beginning a harsh reality where geopolitics is submitted to no limits, no constraints. This proves that the previous diplomatic norms, the guardrails that Donald Trump and others have smashed, are gone. Exhibit B is the greengrocer analogy. This is crucial forensic evidence of the psychological manipulation at play. Carney cites the Czech dissident Václav Havel. He describes a shopkeeper who places a sign in his window. Workers of the world unite, the evidence states.
Every morning, this shopkeeper places a sign in his window. Workers of the world unite. He doesn't believe it. No one does. But he places the sign anyway to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to get along. And because every shopkeeper on every street does the same, the system persists. Not through violence alone, but through the participation of ordinary people in rituals they privately know to be false.
He doesn't believe it. No one does. But he places the sign anyway to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to get along. This is the forensic proof of how the international system has been operating. The system's power comes not from truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true. The evidence proves that for decades, countries like Canada participated in this lie. They praised its principles and benefited from its predictability while knowing the story was partially false. They knew the strongest powers, like the United States, would exempt themselves when convenient. But they kept the sign in the window. What does this prove? It proves that the stability we thought we had was based on a performance, not a law. It proves that the bargain where American hegemony provided public goods in exchange for this compliance is dead. The evidence explicitly states this bargain no longer works. Exhibit C is the weaponization of economy. The evidence traces the specific actions of great powers.
But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination.
They have begun using economic integration as weapons. They use tariffs as leverage. They use financial infrastructure as coercion. This is the forensic footprint of the Trump doctrine. It proves that integration, which was sold to the world as a source of mutual benefit, has been twisted into a source of your subordination. Exhibit D addresses the specific claims regarding Greenland. The evidence shows that Donald Trump has claimed Greenland is under threat to justify his actions. When asked if the threat from Russia or China is for real, Prime Minister Carney states that while Russia is a threat, the threat is more prospective than actual at this stage in terms of actual activity. This refutes the immediate justification for hostile actions against an ally. The evidence shows Canada strongly opposes tariffs over Greenland. We must analyze the power dynamics revealed by this evidence. This is a story of control. The great powers, identified here as the hegemons, are exercising control by exploiting the vulnerabilities of their allies. The mechanism of control is the willingness to perform. When a middle power like Canada or Denmark negotiates bilaterally with a hegemon like the United States under Trump, the power dynamic is structurally rigged. The evidence states, when we only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, we negotiate from weakness.
But when we only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, we negotiate from weakness. We accept what's offered. We compete with each other to be the most accommodating. This is not sovereignty. It's the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination.
The control mechanism is designed to force countries to compete with each other to be the most accommodating. This is the definition of subordination. The source text identifies this not as sovereignty, but as the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. The intent of the power structure created by Trump and similar leaders is to force allies to buy insurance and increase options just to survive. Consider the control exerted through risk management. The evidence shows that allies are forced to diversify not because they want to, but to hedge against uncertainty created by the hegemon. The power of the hegemon relies on the fragmentation of the middle powers. If the middle powers remain separate, building their own fortresses, they become poorer and more fragile. This fragility increases the control of the great power. However, the evidence also reveals the limit of this power. The source states that hegemons cannot continually monetize their relationships. There is a breaking point. The control fractures when the greengrocer removes his sign. When the middle powers decide to stop pretending and name reality, the illusion of the hegemon's absolute control begins to crack. The strongest defense argument for the actions of Donald Trump and the United States is that globalism has failed, that national interests must come first, and that middle powers are simply too weak to resist the will of a superpower. The defense argues that Canada is uniquely vulnerable to pressure because of its trade dependence on the United States. The defense argues that resistance is futile and compliance is the only rational path. We dismantle this defense using the law and the sources provided. First, the claim of vulnerability is dismantled by the facts on the record. Prime Minister Carney provides the forensic accounting. Canada has created more jobs since the tariffs were put on than the United States in absolute number. The Canadian economy is growing at the second fastest rate within the G7, despite the pressure. This proves that the coercive power of the hegemon is not absolute. The defense that Canada must submit to survive is false. Second, the defense that middle powers are weak is dismantled by the strategic autonomy argument. The source proves that Canada is fast-tracking $1 trillion of investments in energy and AI to build domestic strength. They are not waiting for the U.S. They are signing 12 other trade and security deals on 4 continents in 6 months. Third, the defense that the U.S. can dictate terms on issues like Greenland is dismantled by the coalition strategy. Canada is not acting alone. They are standing firmly with Greenland and Denmark. They are working with the Nordic-Baltic 8. The source reveals that the Nordics plus Canada represents 20% of global GDP. This is not a negligible force. This is a massive economic bloc that can withstand pressure. The defense that globalism is the enemy is dismantled by the reality of the web of connections. The source states that being detached from where you live and the broader needs of society is a failure of leadership, not a virtue. The defense relies on nostalgia, but the source states clearly, nostalgia is not a strategy. We need to understand the legal concepts at play here, specifically the concept of sovereignty. In plain English, we usually think of sovereignty as a country's legal right to exist and make its own laws, recognized by a piece of paper or a treaty. But the evidence tonight teaches us a new, harsher legal definition. Prime Minister Carney redefined sovereignty in this rupture. Sovereignty was once grounded in rules. In the old system, the law protected you. But in this new reality, sovereignty is anchored in the ability to withstand pressure. This is a fundamental change in international law. It means your rights as a nation are only as good as your economic and military resilience. The source describes value-based realism. This is not just a political slogan, it is a legal posture. It means strict adherence to territorial integrity and the prohibition of the use of force except when consistent with the UN Charter. We must also look at Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. The source confirms Canada's commitment to NATO's Article 5 is unwavering. This is the Mutual Defense Clause. However, the legal reality of NATO is being tested. The source states, NATO is experiencing a test right now. The legal education here is that a treaty is only a piece of paper if the members do not have the hard power to back it up. That is why the source emphasizes boots on the ground, boots on the ice. The law requires enforcement. Without the capacity to feed itself, fuel itself, or defend itself, a country has no legal options when the rules no longer protect it. It is my professional judgment, based on the evidence, that the current leadership of the great powers described in this text represents a catastrophic failure of responsibility. The evidence shows that these powers have abandoned even the pretense of rules and values for the unhindered pursuit of their power. This is a judgment on fitness. A leader who uses supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited against allies is not fit to lead an international order. A leader who forces neighbors to compete with each other to be the most accommodating is destroying the very stability that allows for prosperity. In contrast, the judgment on the response by Canada and its partners is one of clear-eyed realism. Prime Minister Carney demonstrates the responsibility to name reality. The refusal to mourn the old order and the determination to act accordingly is the only responsible course of action. The evidence shows a government that is principled and pragmatic, actively engaging with the world as it is, not as they wish it to be. To support this judgment, we rely on a stack of expert authorities cited in the record. First, we have Prime Minister Mark Carney himself. The source identifies his credentials. Formerly of Goldman Sachs, a central banker, a leader comfortable in the highest levels of global finance. He brings the authority of economic expertise to the geopolitical analysis. He knows the math of the $1 trillion of investments. Second, we have the authority of Václav Havel, the Czech dissident and later president. Havel is the expert witness on the nature of living within a lie. His authority is used to diagnose the psychological compliance of the international community. He proves that the system persists only through the participation of ordinary people in rituals they privately know to be false. Third, we have Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland. He is cited as the authority on value-based realism. This provides the diplomatic framework for the argument. Fourth, we have the authority of Thucydides, the ancient historian reference regarding the natural logic of the strong doing what they can and the weak suffering what they must. This historical authority is invoked to show exactly what Canada is rejecting. We must look at the institutions that have failed. The evidence is an indictment of the current state of institutional accountability. The World Trade Organization, WTO, the United Nations, UN, and the Conference of the Parties, COP, are specifically named. The evidence states, the multilateral institutions on which the middle powers have relied are under threat. These institutions, the very architecture of collective problem solving, are failing to protect the weak from the strong. The Department of Justice equivalent in this geopolitical court is the enforcement of international law. The evidence shows that this enforcement is broken. We knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. That failure of equal justice has led directly to the current rupture. There is also accountability regarding the Board of Peace proposed by Donald Trump. The evidence shows Canada has been invited to join this institution. However, the accountability check here is severe. Prime Minister Carney insists that any such board must strictly adhere to UN Security Council Resolution 2803 and must coincide with the full flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. The evidence shows the conditions there are horrific. The institution is being held accountable to the reality on the ground, not just the political whim of the proposer. NATO is also held to account. It is being tested. The source demands that NATO deliver on the security of the Arctic. It is not enough to exist. It must act. What are the procedural consequences of this verdict? We are not offering hope or hype tonight. We are looking at the sentencing guidelines for a world that has broken its own rules. The consequence of the rupture is a world of fortresses. The evidence states clearly, a world of fortresses will be poorer, more fragile, and less sustainable. If the great powers continue on this path, the gains from transactionalism will become harder to replicate. That is the sentence: poverty and fragility. There is a procedural consequence for the middle powers. They face a choice. They can compete with each other for favor or combine to create a third path. The evidence shows that if they do not act together, if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. The procedural consequence for the United States and other hegemons is the loss of influence. Allies will diversify to hedge against uncertainty. The source proves this is already happening. Canada is concluding partnerships with China, Qatar, ASEAN, and the EU. The consequence of American bullying is that allies are building bridges between the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the EU, creating a trading bloc of 1.5 billion people that does not center on the United States. The final procedural consequence is the removal of the sign. The evidence states, we are taking the sign out of the window. The old order is not coming back. Nostalgia is dead. The consequence is a new reality where power is measured by the capacity to stop pretending and the strength to stand alone if necessary. That is the harsh reality. That is the verdict. Let us go deeper into the specific evidence regarding the Board of Peace and the Trump administration's proposals. The source transcript includes a specific interrogation regarding $1 billion buy-in for permanent membership on this board. This is the ultimate evidence of the transactional nature of the new order. The claim is that you can buy a seat at the table of peace. The evidence shows Prime Minister Carney's response. Canada would write checks, but only to improve the welfare of the people of Palestine, not to play a political game. He demands that the outcomes be delivered direct. This dismantles the pay-to-play structure proposed by the authorities linked to Trump. We must also examine the evidence regarding China. The prosecutorial analysis here is critical. The lie often told is that you must decouple completely from rivals. The evidence shows Canada engaging in a comprehensive strategic partnership with China. Why? Because the guardrails are clear. The evidence proves that you can have a strategic partnership within guardrails that includes energy and financial services. This contradicts the narrative that the world must be split into two neat camps. The evidence supports a dense web of connections. Look at the specific evidence of de-risking. The source asks if de-risking is going into reverse. The answer from the evidence is that you need a web of connections to be resilient. To miss out on China, India, or Mercosur is a mistake. This is a direct refutation of the isolationist policies pushed by the hegemons. The evidence argues that managing these relationships makes you stronger and more resilient. Let's return to the greengrocer. This piece of evidence cannot be overstated. When Carney says the power of the less power starts with honesty, he is establishing a new legal standard for international relations. The dishonesty of the past decades, the living within a lie, was the lubricant for the global economy. The removal of that lubricant is the rupture. The evidence lists the crises that led to this: finance, health, energy, and geopolitics. These are not abstract concepts. These are the counts in the indictment. The extreme global integration created risks that were ignored. Now those risks are being weaponized. The supply chains as vulnerabilities is a specific charge. It means that when you buy a product or rely on a fuel source, you are giving a foreign power a weapon to use against you. The source says we can no longer live within the lie of mutual benefit. We must also scrutinize the evidence regarding the Arctic. The source explicitly mentions boots on the ice. This is literal evidence. Canada is investing in over-the-horizon radar, submarines, and aircraft. Why? Because the old comfortable assumptions that geography provided security are no longer valid. The evidence proves that the physical safety of the North is no longer guaranteed by treaties alone. It requires unprecedented investments. The source also provides evidence of a buyer's club for critical minerals. This is a mechanism of resistance. By anchoring this club in the G7, the middle powers are diversifying away from concentrated supply. This is a direct countermeasure to the economic coercion identified earlier in the text. We must look at the timeline. The source mentions the, quote, past few days regarding new partnerships. This is happening now. This is not a theoretical future. The quote-unquote rupture is in progress. The quote-unquote start of phase 2 of the Board of Peace process is mentioned. The quote-unquote assault on Ukraine is described as, quote, almost at its 4th year. The timeline evidence confirms that we are deep into this new, harsh reality. Finally, we look at the evidence of, quote, variable geometry. This is the term used by the Prime Minister. It means different coalitions for different issues. This is the procedural method for surviving the rupture. You do not have one fixed alliance. You have a coalition for Ukraine, a coalition for the Arctic, a coalition for trade. The evidence proves that Canada is a, quote, core member of the coalition of the willing on Ukraine. This, quote, variable geometry is the only defense against the rigid, binary choice offered by the hegemons. The verdict is clear. The lie that we can return to the old order is dead. The lie that compliance brings safety is exposed. The only path forward, as proven by the evidence tonight, is to take the sign out of the window, build strength at home, and forge new pragmatic alliances that do not depend on the permission of a single great power. That is the reality. That is the law of the New World Order. And that is the final word.